Good evening. My name is Jennifer McGuire. I'm the General Manager of CBC News and the CBC Local Services, and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of CBC News. My official function here today is the greeting, the Walmart greeting of the J-Talks tonight, and I would like to welcome you to the J-Talk with Greenwald here in the Glenn Gould studio of the CBC. We are incredibly happy to support this, and certainly it was a bit of a homecoming for me in the green room seeing John Cruikshank and David Walmsley, both alumni of CBC News, and indeed Glenn, who has done some phenomenal work with CBC News. So welcome, enjoy. It's going to be a fascinating and illuminating conversation about this incredible journey of journalism. And we'll start tonight's evening officially by welcoming John Cruikshank, who is, I think, where is John? He's John Cruikshank, the chair of the CJF board, and obviously with the Toronto Star, and here he is, right on cue. Welcome, thank you.
Good evening. What a great choice you made in coming here tonight. It's going to be a spectacular evening. I want to first thank Jennifer McGuire, my friend and the news leader here at CBC. CBC is the media partner for this event and has been a great constituent partner of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. I want to also thank BMO Financial Group. BMO is the exclusive J-Talk series sponsor, and so they've had a lot to do with keeping the conversation about great journalism going. If you have thoughts about tonight's topic, that is the power, secrecy, global surveillance, and the role of journalism in this advanced digital age, you can raise issues, you can suggest questions on Twitter hashtag CJF J-Talk. My real role here tonight is to introduce David Walmsley. And I mean, it's very odd. I kind of feel like I'm either being shadowed by David or I'm shadowing him, because we both sort of landed in the same places. We first met some years ago as we tried to get the National Post off the ground. I gave that up as a bad thing almost immediately and went off and did something else. David stuck to it a little while longer, but since then he's been at the Toronto Star, he's been at the Globe and Mail a couple of times. I think he's landed for good now, and he certainly has been here at the CBC. David he has a tremendous news intelligence, and while we maintain tremendous competition between the titles in this city, I think there's been a great diversification in what the titles do, and nobody applauded David's appointment to the Globe and Mail more loudly than I, because I think he's contributed to the depth of work that happens when there are a lot of folks who are trying to get at the truth, and trying to do it not in a dispassionate way, but rather with great verve and great passion for what's necessary for all of us to understand and get as deeply vested in this democracy as we must if it's to remain relevant. So with that, I want to turn things over to my friend and rival, David Walmsley.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a very special evening with a very special story. I think there's a lot of you in the auditorium tonight who have strong views on what we're going to hear about. Many of you probably are supporters. Some of you probably question the motivations, but all of you have an opinion. And my role for the next short period is to elucidate that in as great detail as we can. I don't think you can forget that the intensity of the last 18 months since this story broke, or 16 months since this story broke, have seen an enormous number of moments, none of which we can all easily remember. And so in order to, I suppose, help remind us of some of the aspects that our special guest has experienced, we've compiled a tape which I'd like you all to focus on the screen, and we'll run the video. Thank you.
And so they publish a shock and awe series of reports, 5 consecutive days of pounding coverage, as Greenwald had planned it. In those first stories, we learn the NSA is collecting telephone records and emails of millions of Americans through a government-approved court order and programs like PRISM. For ordinary people, the idea of government surveillance is made real.
What do you think of Glenn Greenwald? He's made quite clear that there are documents that he's seen that he thinks go beyond where journalism should go. That he's drawing the line.
Right. And his qualifications for that decision?
He's a journalist.
Right.
So he's unqualified to make that decision?
I would say he's less qualified than the British, the American, or the Australian government, who have decided that they have a legitimate reason for keeping these secret.
My view of journalism is that the more people in power abuse that power, the more accountability and transparency they prove that they need through journalism. And so when I see a government like the UK barge into the newsroom of the newspaper with which I work and demand that they destroy their computers, something you would expect to hear in Iran or Russia or China, or when they detain someone they think is working with a journalist under a terrorism law for 9 hours and basically acknowledge through the media that they're doing it to be intimidating, that is a government that is attacking press freedom and abusing their power and showing that they need more transparency. And that's the role of journalism.
Yeah, it's harder to smash up a computer than you might think.
The paper, which had other copies of the Snowden files overseas, agreed to take an angle grinder to the computer while the intelligence agents watched.
I can understand why the President of the United States would say, you know, I was elected to this office. How come Glenn Greenwald gets to decide what's classified in America?
Yeah, well, unfortunately for that point of view, there's this thing called the Constitution, the First Amendment of which guarantees a free press. I didn't hear any liberals saying, how come whistleblowers took it upon themselves to reveal the Bush torture program or the NSA warrantless eavesdropping program or Abu Ghraib abuses, also things that were kept secret. And the reason is that part of our democracy requires that when the government keeps things secret, that the citizenry has a right to know.
To the extent that you have aided and abetted Snowden, even in his current movements, why shouldn't you, Mr. Greenwald, be charged with a crime?
I think it's pretty extraordinary that anybody who would call themselves a journalist would publicly muse about whether or not other journalists should be charged with felonies. The assumption in your question, David, is completely without evidence, the idea that I've aided and abetted him in any way. If you want to embrace that theory, it means that every investigative journalist in the United States who works with their sources, who receives classified information, is a criminal.
Ladies and gentlemen, Glenn Greenwald.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
It's quite the reception for a criminal narcissist.
Actually, in Canada, I'm known as a porno spy. That was an actual term I was called in the Canadian Parliament, one of my favorite events of the last year.
It's a fascinating audience, a lot of journalists, a lot of academics, business leaders, those who are concerned citizens and interested in general topics. Spies are pretty sexy, secrets are even more so. But I think that the purpose of this evening is to go on 2 journeys. The first one's your personal journey with respect to the weight and the fortitude of the developments that you couldn't control and those you could. And the second one, I think, is really to reflect on the fact that you're not a journalist to begin with. You're a constitutional lawyer by training. And yet, what you've done, both in your book and I think in a lot of your public statements, is highlighted something that the industry has been very poor at doing, and that is explaining the engineering process of rigorous journalism. As an industry, we haven't presented at all well the complexities, the rigor, the challenge functions that exist internally before we finally publish. And by the time you had arrived in Hong Kong, in many ways, through no choice, because my sense in reading your book is that you were actually the chosen one. You were chosen by Edward Snowden. And you had a challenge around your inability to encrypt material. But you got to a point where you changed and widened the scope for journalists to begin to explain, I think with a certain amount of pride, how it is a story gets done. But before we get to Hong Kong and before we arrive with meeting Edward Snowden, walk me through those first days, the first hint, perhaps, that you thought you were onto something beyond which, presumably, it had grown beyond your ken.
Well, when I was first contacted by this person who was anonymous, and he was claiming he had very significant information, but was uncomfortable talking about what it was until I installed encryption, I had no conception at all that he was even a sane person, let alone an important source, because we were in this catch-22 where he was unwilling to say anything about what he was doing for reasons that we all now understand are quite valid without being in an encrypted environment where the government couldn't eavesdrop on what he was saying. And so we did this dance for a long time, and when I was finally able to start communicating with him, it was just very apparent to me that this was an extremely rational, thoughtful person who had embarked on this course not impetuously or through some kind of framework of delusion, but through a very grounded act of conscience, that he had genuinely believed that he had confronted some kind of a grave injustice and felt obligated to act, even if it meant unraveling his whole life, if not destroying it. And so a lot of what you have to do as a journalist, I think, and what you do as a human being when you're trying to evaluate other people and their motives, is you use your own intuition and your own sense of judgment, and I did that a lot. But despite how confident I was in that, I wasn't going to fly all the way across the world based on someone who I couldn't see or touch or feel or even know their name until I had some evidence. And I asked for some, and he sent me 24 documents that were, you know, probably the most extraordinary documents I've ever seen in my career as a lawyer or a journalist, to the point where I literally physically couldn't breathe when I got them. Part of them were the PRISM documents. Others were just training materials of the NSA. And I didn't know at the time that this was the tiniest tip of the iceberg. I mean, just the documents he sent by themselves, the PRISM story by itself would have been a huge story, and that was more than enough to get me to get on a plane and fly to Hong Kong. And it was on the plane ride over to Hong Kong when, for the first time, I saw what we now understand to be the first part of the archive, and the magnitude of what was in it. Not just the number of documents, although it numbered in the many thousands, but the sensitivity of it made me realize that this was going to be a story unlike any other that we've seen in many years.
So, you're chosen. Why did he choose you?
A lot of other journalists who aren't particularly happy that he chose me as opposed to them like to theorize about that question. And typically what they'll say, because it glorifies them, is that the reason that he chose me is because he didn't want anyone objective or neutral. He wanted somebody who was ideologically compatible. And that because I had spent years warning about the dangers of surveillance, which I had, that he thought that I was this kind of like-minded kindred spirit who shared his political perspectives. That's the flattery that journalists who aren't happy about not being chosen like to tell themselves and others about why. But the real reason that that happened isn't actually because of anything having to do with my views on surveillance. I do think he wanted somebody who had expertise in surveillance, who had spent time thinking about it just to understand the documents. but he was much more interested in my views on journalism than he was my views on surveillance. And specifically, what he was petrified about was that there were these scandals in the United States, or what should be scandals, what I regard as a scandal, journalistically, where in the post-9/11 era, major newspapers like the New York Times learned of very significant government policies that had been kept secret. But instead of publishing those stories, they sat on them because the government asked them to. The most infamous case was when the New York Times, Jim Risen and Eric Lichtblau, learned that the Bush administration was spying on American citizens without the warrants required by law. And these reporters were ready to report the story. They went to the government. George Bush said, "Is my microphone cutting out?" Yeah, maybe I can just move it up. See if that helps. And the New York Times went to the White House, and George Bush said, "If you report this story, you'll help the terrorists, you're going to endanger Americans." There was no rationale to it, no logic to it. And so the New York Times sat on the story for over a year, allowing George Bush to be reelected without the American people knowing about this program. And it was only because Jim Risen was about to publish the story in his book, because he got so frustrated not being able to report it, did the New York Times then finally agree to publish it, and then they won a Pulitzer Prize for it and celebrated their own bravery and all of that. But Edward Snowden was petrified that he was going to unravel his life and come to an institution like the New York Times with all of this material, only for them to refuse to report virtually all of it because the government would tell them that doing so would endanger national security. And I had been very critical of the Times specifically, and of American journalism generally, for being far too deferential to the government, for not being willing to be adversarial in their relationship to the government. And so I think he knew and was very convinced that I'd be willing to report the story aggressively, that I would not take seriously vague and ambiguous appeals to national security as a means of concealing this information. I think that really is what drove him not only to come to me, but also to Laura Poitras, who was independent in her own right, and he felt like our being outside of this kind of New York, Washington political media axis was what he needed to make sure that this information got reported the way he wanted it to get out.
So a big message for journalists in the room: conformity is your enemy. Bravery and singularity of purpose, commitment and gut, and having hierarchical institutions that can, despite themselves, make the right decision. New York Times is self-defeated in its inability to own this story. That's a pretty solemn lesson, I think, certainly for me, if I'm going to be a leader in journalism. In terms of your story, it's almost, if I close my eyes and thought of it as a soundtrack, the drama is you're, having problems breathing, reading these documents. You're on a flight across to Hong Kong. You arrive there. You have no idea what this guy looks like.
We know nothing about him. I learned his name for the first time on the flight over. He had included it in one of the documents that I read for the first time. But even then, I didn't know anything about him demographically, what he looked like, what his age was, what his background was, where he had worked. We knew nothing. And I think we've all had that experience before where we talk to somebody exclusively online and we form a mental impression of what they are like, and then we meet them in real life, and invariably they're exactly the opposite of what we assumed. Well, that was very much the experience we had. I mean, both Laura and I had assumed, I think without even really discussing it, that this must be somebody in their 60s or even their 70s. And we thought that in part because of the sophistication of his insight into political and strategic questions, not just surveillance policies, but more so because I knew that he was, from the beginning, not just willing, but eager to come forward and publicly identify himself as the source of these materials. He never, like most sources do, had any intention of hiding. He didn't want us to protect his identity. And so here was somebody that I knew was knowingly risking all of their liberty, willing to go to prison for decades, if not the rest of their lives. In the climate in which the United States currently exists, whistleblowers, even trivial ones, get put into prison for years, let alone one of this magnitude. And so I just assumed that somebody who reached that point, A, must have been around these institutions for a really long time to get to the point where they were that convinced that the injustice was sufficient to take that risk. And then also I assume that, you know, I think it's probably easier to go to prison for the rest of your life if your life expectancy is 10 years rather than 50. And so all these reasons had this impression of him in my head as somebody who was, you know, at the end of his career. And then so to meet this kid, and he was 29, but he looked, you know, like a 23-year-old kind of video game geek that you see in every single shopping mall throughout North America, in a white t-shirt and scraggly jeans and very kind of skinny, pale appearance. It was extremely disorienting and actually raised a lot of questions and doubts and suspicions about whether we had analyzed the situation correctly. And we spent a long time trying to give ourselves the assurance that he actually was who we thought he was once we saw him.
That is the other hand that perhaps to those who are journalists and work with sources who aren't journalists but understand the language that probably or certainly is overused around anonymous sourcing. But there's usually a traditional burden when you do these stories that the intent is that the source is protected through the anonymity. So you find yourself very quickly having to protect your source with the identity from a very clear conscious decision mutually agreed to that Edward Snowden would become known to the world almost as soon as the first story ran. That's a different burden.
It is a different burden, and on some levels, for me, it was a more difficult one, because I had this conflict from the very start, which was, I mean, I really believe that one of the most odious developments in the post-9/11 era in the United States, and having been to New Zealand recently and involved in a lot in the UK and having done a lot of reporting here, I think it actually prevails in all of the English-speaking Western democracies, is this climate of fear that has been deliberately cultivated, where governments that are democratic in nature can't and won't put dissidents into prison in huge numbers, but they want to nonetheless have the same degree of control. And this climate of fear is one that says that if you meaningfully challenge anything that we do by opposing our policies or disclosing information that we want kept secret about what we're doing, we will destroy you. We can put you in Guantanamo and show the world that you're in orange jumpsuits, and we can torture you. We can prosecute you under World War I era statutes for going to journalists and helping them report stories. But whatever it is, we can destroy your life. And this has created this climate where sources are petrified of being discovered, and it's destroyed the news gathering process. Sources are afraid to talk to journalists. And so this decision that he was prepared to make was one that I really believed was going to be unbelievably powerful. This extreme act of defiance to say, you know, what I've done, I believe in to such an extent that I'm not going to hide and I'm not going to skulk in the shadows. You don't have to launch some investigation and try and find out who did this. Here I am. I'm the one who did it. I'm proud of what I did, and I'm going to step forward and publicly identify myself and account to my fellow citizens and the people around the world for what I did and explain why I did it. And I knew the power of that act was going to be so profound. I thought it was going to be far more significant than the individual disclosures themselves, that I was at least as excited about being a part of that as I was doing the reporting. The problem was that I needed to know that if I was going to encourage somebody to do that and help them do it, that they fully understood the ramifications of what would likely happen to their life irreversibly if they did it. I needed to know that it was the byproduct of a process of reason and conscience and not some instability or delusion or some impetuous act. And so I had this conflict where I didn't, and so once I saw his age, his youth, that concern became even more acute for me, because I felt like there was this prospect that we could end up pushing him into doing something that we wanted him to do, without being first certain that he himself had chosen that through a reliable act. And that's why my main priority for the first 3 or 4 days in Hong Kong was to just interrogate him relentlessly about the thought process behind this decision. And once I became convinced that it was really the byproduct of his own autonomy and agency, and he understood fully what he was getting himself into, only then did I become truly enrolled in this choice. And that was when we started filming the video that famously was the one where he unveiled himself to the world.
I know already I'm not going to have enough time to ask all the questions I have, but I want to just do one housekeeping note at this point, which is, as we get towards the 8 o'clock mark Eastern Time, there will be 3 mics put out on the aisles, and we'll take 25 minutes of questions. And those of you who are watching live stream, there is also a Twitter handle, hashtag CJF J-Talk. Hashtag CJF J-Talk, and we'll take any questions that come in from Twitter as well. So, you're just coming back from New York, where there was the world premiere of what I think provides almost a third rail in the stunning story, because on the one hand, there is the engineering and the journalism and the arguments of Glenn Greenwald and his motivation. There is Edward Snowden and who he is and what decisions he was making. And then there is this remarkable first-person authenticity. When this movie is released publicly in the next few weeks, Citizen 4 by Laura Poitras, where we finally meet Edward Snowden as if it's the first time. Walk me through the emotions of that, Glenn.
I mean, I think this film is so critically important because one of the things that happens whenever you have somebody who challenges the world's most powerful government, which actually still is the United States, the way Edward Snowden did, is there's all kinds of tactics they deploy in every single case to destroy the person's reputation as a means of discrediting not only what they've done, but also the substance of the disclosures themselves. I look to the example of Daniel Ellsberg, who we were talking about just before the event, who was one of my political heroes growing up. And but the one thing I never quite understood about Daniel Ellsberg was that in response to his disclosure of the Pentagon Papers, which proved the US government had been systematically lying to the citizenry for years about the Vietnam War, the response of the Nixon administration was to send people to break into the office of his psychoanalyst in order to discover his psychosexual secrets and be able to attack him that way. And I never understood why that was anything other than a total non sequitur, why the Nixon administration thought that would be effective. I mean, here on the one hand are documents showing the lies about a war, and then the response was, well, Daniel Ellsberg has some unnatural attraction to his sister or something. And I never got why anyone thought that would be effective. And I actually have had the honor of becoming friends with Daniel Ellsberg, and he's a colleague of mine in several different projects. And I asked him about that once. I said, why did anyone think that would work? And he said, you're thinking about this way too rationally. That's not how human beings reason. And what he explained was that if you can take somebody whose political acts you want to discredit and demonize them on a level of their personality or just their character, to such an extent that you actually make people uncomfortable thinking about who they are, what they've done, people will just want to run away from not just them, but the byproduct of their work. And this process of demonization you see over and over with anybody who becomes a whistleblower or a leaker. And so much has been said about Edward Snowden over the last year and 4 months, and so much of it is just patently absurd. People have said that he's motivated by profit, when in reality he could have sold these documents for many, many millions of dollars to multiple agencies around the world and been extremely rich for the rest of his life, and he didn't do that. He brought them to journalists. Other people have said that he's motivated by narcissism and fame. This somehow became this instantaneous script of the American media. Within literally a week after learning who he was, all these American journalists who had no idea what he had ever done in his life, didn't know him at all, suddenly decided they could literally psychologically diagnose him from afar, and they declared in unison that he was this fame-seeking narcissist. The reality is that, you know, from the beginning, he was very clear that once he came forward in that video that we were going to do, he was going to disappear from the media completely because he didn't want the focus to be on him. He wanted it to be on the revelations. And literally for months, I had calls every single day from the biggest television stars in America wanting an interview with him. And he said no to every single one of them. Kind of strange behavior for a fame-seeking narcissist, I think. But that was the nature of the attacks on him, were completely reckless and inaccurate claims that were made about him over and over. And this is really because of that strategy that he stuck to for essentially a year, which was, I'm going to stay out of the media, I'm going to let the documents do the talking. The demonization campaign, to some extent, was allowed to work because he wasn't really in front of people showing them who he was. And this film is the first time that people get to watch Edward Snowden, not as he tries to craft his image retrospectively by sitting down in an interview and explaining what he did and why, but being able to watch the whole event unfold, watch the decision-making process that he embarked on while we were in that hotel room with him in Hong Kong, because he allowed Laura to film what we were doing from the very first moment that we started. And this film is so extraordinary because it has firsthand, real-time footage of what we did in Hong Kong. That's the bulk of the film. And so people are going to get to decide for themselves who Edward Snowden is and what actually motivated him by watching him do it as he did it and make up their own minds. And for me, the more people see of Edward Snowden, the better, because they'll realize how utterly and facially false those demonization tactics are. And I think more and more people are going to be inspired by the choice he made.
It's even further than that, though, isn't it? Because the assumption for many would be that Edward Snowden, he's done what he did. He's now in Russia. No one here is ever going to meet him. The story ends. And there was probably a certain amount of spin and a certain amount of assumption that he was going to become the Kim Philby of the 21st century. He would live forever in Moscow in exile, essentially an alcoholic, not really remembered, and that's the end of it. But what the film shows is that his partner, who he had left in secret to go from Hawaii to Hong Kong, has now moved to Russia.
Right. The word Russia just sends the American media class into like seizures of hysteria. I mean, like the blind irrationality that it causes is shocking. And I mean, it's like the Cold War never ended. I mean, it's every bit as potent as it was in 1958. The Red Scare is just a permanent fixture, I think, in American political discourse. And I mean, I'm always amazed because people always say, oh, well, on some level, his punishment is even worse than prison. He has to live in Russia. As though all 160 million people who live in Russia are just consigned to pure and unadulterated misery. And oftentimes they'll even cite the weather in Russia. Like they'll say, well, it's really cold. And I always say, well, actually, no, it's really cold in Canada too. And like in Minnesota, and even New York, and no one thinks that the people there are eternally miserable. But you're right. I mean, this has been one of the ways that he's been talked about is, you know, first of all, there's real questions about whether that's even an accurate depiction of Kim Philby, the British spy who defected to Russia. But even assuming it is, the idea, you know, I've heard it said so often. There was actually an article in the New Republic, an American political journal, that said he's going to die, you know, of cirrhosis of the liver in his 50s because he's going to just be a miserable, lonely drunk. First of all, he doesn't even drink. Like, literally, he never drinks. So it's unlikely that he's going to die of cirrhosis of the liver. But, you know, the reality is that when we were in Hong Kong, we all assumed, I mean, our working assumption was that he was going to be, and sooner rather than later, in the custody of the American government. He would be marched into a courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit and chains, and that the next time we saw him would be when we visited him in a federal penitentiary, if we even had visitation rights. I mean, we were all, we didn't think that was a possibility. We thought that was essentially the inevitable outcome of the choice that he had embarked on. And instead, he has managed to remain outside of the grasp of the American government, and he's further outside of their grasp now than ever. And instead of being in a prison, he is able to participate very actively and constructively in the debate that he catalyzed. He gives speeches, he does interviews, he writes columns, he wins awards. He has become a really important voice in the debate that he helped to catalyze. And as you say, on a personal level, his family visits him, he's learning Russian, his girlfriend has now joined him where she's living, and I assume they're going to get married. He has said many times that he didn't choose to be in Russia. He was forced to be there by the US government that didn't let him leave when they invalidated his passport. If he had the choice, he would live in the country that he was raised in, where his family is and the culture that he knows. But, he has created a very fulfilling life for himself, and it's an important subversion of this propaganda tactic, which is that if you challenge the US government, you are consigned to a life of misery. And I think that is a really important lesson that has been learned from this.
And what about yourself? Edward Snowden isn't coming back to the United States. You've lived in Rio for 9 years. Do you think you'll be able to go to the United States? Have you been back to the United States?
There was a good period of about 9 months when the US government at the highest levels, President Obama's senior national security official, James Clapper, the head of the NSA, Keith Alexander, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Rogers, were publicly calling us criminals and strongly insinuating that if we went back, we could be arrested and prosecuted. But even more alarmingly for us was that privately they were sending those same signals. We had lawyers who have high contacts with the Justice Department trying to find out whether if we did go back, Laura was in Berlin doing her work and I was in Brazil doing mine, whether if we did go back, we would be arrested, and they were purposely leaving us in this state of uncertainty and even implying that there was a chance that we would. And we had a real dilemma about that because on the one hand, we were never going to allow the US government to exile us for the crime of doing journalism. But on the other hand, being charged with espionage in post 9/11 America and having the US government accuse you of endangering national security is something that can send you to prison for a very long time, despite being guilty of nothing. And there's lots of examples demonstrating that. And so we took that threat very, very seriously. There's actually in retrospect, amusing dialogue that Laura found that we had online, encrypted, that she put in her film, where I think it was in September, a few months after we got back from Hong Kong, when I said to her, would you be willing to travel back to the US? And she said, I don't know. What about you? And I said, I don't know. And then she said, I think there's a very high chance that if we went back, we would immediately be subpoenaed for our journalism records and our testimony. And I said in response, for me, that would be the best case scenario. So, we really did have that concern, and they wanted us to have that concern. On top of which, the UK government going into the Guardian newsroom and doing what they did, detaining my partner for 11 hours under a terrorism law. There's still an active criminal case. They clearly wanted this concern in our brain to exist, that every time we had to consider whether to publish a new document, they wanted us to be worried, would this next story be what would push them over the line and cause them to arrest and prosecute us? And we finally did go back in April, and the only reason we went back was because it just happened to be that we had won this major journalism award, the George Polk National Security Reporting Award, and we timed our return on the plane so that we landed at JFK Airport while the ceremony was underway, and we had 2 empty seats, so there was a room full of 400 journalists waiting for us to arrive. And the following day was the Pulitzer announcements, and we thought we had a good shot at our work winning that, and so that would be a pretty high cost for the US government to arrest us on our way to receiving a major journalism award, and then having us be in jail when the Pulitzers were announced. And so we calculated that the cost for the government would be too high, and we took the chance, and it worked out. But even just the mere mention of that possibility, I remember one time I turned on CNN, it was about 2 weeks after that David Gregory interview, and I was flipping through the channels, and there was a CNN debate. And, they have debates like, should taxes be increased, or should there be immigration reform? And they'll have the little topic in red letters on the graphic of the screen about what the debate is. And this debate, the red letters said, should Glenn Greenwald be prosecuted? And I remember flipping through and I was like, oh my God, wow, there's like a panel convened to discuss this question, like any other political policy question. That's the climate that was deliberately created for those of us who were doing the journalism, and that was always hovering over everything we did.
So it's a high bar when you're met by the border agent if you have to win a Pulitzer every time you want to go home. In the video that we showed at the beginning, there was an almost beyond belief scene as they took the computer hard drive apart in the basement of The Guardian. So today, in retrospect, The Guardian would be seen to have played a key role. It was able to bridge this split between your journalism, the documentation, and the source management with the ability to amplify through a wider audience the final story. You've spoken a lot about big media, and we shouldn't shirk it. I certainly represent traditional media, and we should confront that. But with respect to The Guardian, you were 30 minutes away from walking away from that. So it's well presented in the book, but for those who haven't managed to read it yet, tell us a little bit about that pivotal moment where it could all have gone very differently.
The really strange part about what happened with this story that I think hasn't been fully appreciated is that when I went to Hong Kong, I had been at The Guardian for all of 9 months. And my arrangement with The Guardian was the same arrangement I've had since I began working in journalism, which is basically, I will write for you, I'll produce a lot of traffic for you, and everything else is explained by nothing other than the fact that you just leave me alone. Like, you don't edit anything I write, you don't assign me things, you just go away, and I'll produce for you, and that's it. And that was my relationship with The Guardian. I was in Brazil, I was writing my columns, I was writing whatever I want, I was posting them directly to the internet. I had almost no contact with The Guardian editors by design. That's how I wanted it. And so when I realized what the scope of the story was going to be, and the exposures and the risks involved, I knew that I needed a major institution behind me to do the reporting. And I also knew that whatever I did, it wasn't going to be under this aegis of, I'll just go do what I want and you stay out of it. They were probably going to draw the line when it came to publishing top secret documents from the most powerful government's most secretive agency. They were going to want to be involved. So I went to New York and before I went to Hong Kong, and just to get them on board. And they were very cautious, as they should have been, and skeptical, and they were worried because they had I didn't trust them to do the story the way I thought it should be done, and they didn't trust me because it was a life or death story for them. If it had all gone wrong, it could have destroyed them. And to put it all on the shoulders of someone with whom they had barely worked was too much. And you know, one of the things that really affected me the most about doing this work that will probably affect me for the rest of my life was, you know, seeing this 29-year-old who grew up as ordinary of a life as you can possibly have. I mean, he comes from a lower middle class background. His father, who I've gotten to know, was in the Coast Guard for 30 years. No, completely ordinary in every way. No power, no position, no prestige, nothing. And to see the power of his choice and the extent of his bravery early on so completely affected me that I felt an obligation to do the reporting in the same spirit that he had made his choice, which meant that I didn't want to have weeks and months of meetings with lawyers and editors over what we were going to do. I didn't want to spend weeks negotiating with the US government over. I wanted to publish immediately and aggressively and keep publishing and not stop. And I needed to know that The Guardian was willing to do that and wasn't going to have this kind of institutional caution and these constant impediments to getting this information out to the public that I know that media institutions like to impose just because that's how institutions behave. And so early on, if The Guardian delayed even 5 minutes, like if I wrote an email to The Guardian and they didn't instantly return my email, I was interpreting it through this prism of mistrust, like, oh, they're stalling. You know, I was pretty unreasonable.
It's all right, you'd fit in well in a newsroom, that's fine.
Yeah, exactly. And so there came a point where I was ready to publish the first story, and I was actually ready to publish it 2 days earlier, and I let them talk to their lawyers because I thought that was reasonable, one lawyer meeting before we published. And it went through one edit, and then when it didn't get published on that day, I essentially told them that if it's not published by the end of the day, I was just going to take the story elsewhere because they didn't have the documents, they didn't have the source, and we had a call that day, and they convinced me that they were fully behind the story. They had their last call with the government where they were very defiant when the government was telling them not to publish. And from that point forward, we built trust. And I think what ended up happening was that the courage that Edward Snowden displayed was contagious. It infused me, it infused Laura, it then infused The Guardian. They got very aggressive in their reporting, and then it just spread to lots of other people. And that's what made the story so difficult for the US government to manage, was that there was so much courage and resolve behind it.
Now, in the first week of publication, you did a number of very focused pieces, but one of them, of course, was on PRISM, which showed the scale of the activity. And you were determined to break it, and understandably, you thought, because you had the documents, that you would break the story with your byline in The Guardian. But as history shows, the Washington Post beat you by a matter of minutes, because, as you lay out, a United States government official who had been talked to by the Washington Post previously, as the Washington Post had researched some of the work with Laura Poitras, tipped the Washington Post's hand to say that The Guardian was going to go with the story. So you end up in a situation where the US government official was actually pushing the secret story out faster than you were.
Well, right. I mean, first of all, my main concern was that we broke the Snowden story, and we actually, the day before, published the Verizon story. That was huge in the US. And then I knew the Washington Post was working on the PRISM story. That was essentially one of the only stories. That was the only story they were working on. And once we did the first story, we wanted to beat them on that as well, because I just felt like we were going to do the reporting differently than they would. And I knew the Washington Post publication schedule. I knew they were planning on publishing Sunday, 4 days away, because Laura had been working with the Washington Post. And we were about to publish that day. And we called the government and said, this is what we're going to report today. Do you have any comment? And they exploited that process, because they then went to the Washington Post and they alerted the Post to the fact that we were going to publish, to let the Post publish first, because I guess they, for some reason, like the Post better than us. And I don't blame them. I would like the Post better than us if I were them too. And so, you know, ultimately it didn't really matter, because, and there was probably even a benefit to it. I think the fact that, you know, it was really Laura who made this decision, and I wasn't in favor of it, but in retrospect, I think it turned out to be a good thing. If it had just been me at The Guardian and Laura, you know, just in Germany doing whatever she does, doing the reporting, I think it would have been a lot easier for the government to just not only discredit the reporting, but to criminalize it. By roping in the Washington Post, the sort of favorite establishment journal of official Washington, it became much more difficult to say that the reporting was criminal when their favorite newspaper was involved in these disclosures. And so, I think that it ended up being a good thing, but it made me even more suspicious than I was before of this process where you go to the government and let them give you the feedback on the information that you're going to publish, because they can then give that scoop to a newspaper or a media outlet that they like better and think will do it in a way more favorable to them.
Because this is where big media gets involved, because without your knowledge, The Guardian had forwarded material, let's go back to the beginning, to none other than the New York Times, the organization that had self-defeated itself and written itself out of access to the documents because of its behavior around the domestic eavesdropping program. So the New York Times had it, in part probably because Russ Bridger, as editor of The Guardian, had a concern that prior restraint was not something that existed in the United Kingdom. The First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment both were very important in terms of the United States around privacy and a free press. What did you think when you heard that the New York Times now had the documents?
Yeah, I mean, well, the source specifically wanted the New York Times excluded. it wasn't just that he didn't want to go to the New York Times, he wanted that to be a media story. And it was, and he wanted the question to arise, why isn't the New York Times involved? Because he then wanted me to be able to explain what I explained earlier about the New York Times history of excess deference to the government. We knew this was a journalism story as much as it was a surveillance story. And so it was 2 months into the reporting when the UK government, which, I mean, I knew they were extremist when it came to press freedoms, but I didn't quite grasp the true insanity of that government when it comes to journalism. You know, I mean, I just discovered as part of this process that the British reporter who uncovered the existence of the GCHQ, just its existence, the British have an intelligence agency that engages in electronic surveillance called the GCHQ, Duncan Campbell, who's currently at The Independent, was prosecuted in the 70s and was days away from being imprisoned for having done this reporting. And, you know, the British government hasn't gotten any better. And so they were increasingly threatening with The Guardian, even as the reporting was being recognized around the world as extremely important journalism. And The Guardian was genuinely frightened that the British courts were going to permit the government to go in and physically take the archive. Now, The Guardian only had a part of the archive. They only had the British part of the archive. They didn't have the full archive and still don't. But still, it was an important part of what Snowden had provided. And so when I learned that on the weekend before The Guardian's destroyed its own laptops and archives, while the British agents oversaw it, that they had given it to the New York Times, I was furious. And I wasn't the only one. Edward Snowden wasn't very happy about it either. And when we confronted The Guardian, they had an okay excuse, which was, well, we were worried that we were going to lose an important part of the reporting, and we wanted it to be in the possession of a newspaper that could safeguard it. And it was unlikely the US government was going to march into the New York Times newsroom and destroy it, so it was a way of safeguarding the material. As it turned out, it was an okay decision. The Guardian said to the New York Times, we're giving this to you, but you can't do anything with it unless we say you can. The New York Times ended up doing some okay stories on that archive. But I think by and large, it's widely recognized that the New York Times was deliberately excluded from the process, and that's been a really important part of what this story has been about. And I think it has pressured media outlets to become more, to prove that they are willing to be more adversarial to those who wield political and economic power.
Okay, and that's where we're going to come to with 7 or 8 minutes to go, and then there'll be questions from the floor. And again, for anyone who is watching on live stream, hashtag CJF J-Talk in your Twitter. Questions will be answered from here. So the idea of responsibility is a key one. There was a prosecution in the early 80s of a British civil servant called Clive Ponting, who leaked secrets and was prosecuted under an Official Secrets Act that dated back 80 years. The jury, all the evidence proved it. He himself admitted it. The jury acquitted him. There was not a capacity within the jury to say that the law was not an ass. Today in the United States, the Espionage Act is 1917. 3 people were prosecuted and charged under that act before Obama. It is now another 6 under Obama, so he's tripled the number. The media institutions have to be responsible. How do you navigate between the instinct to simply go with the news and be damned and the need to ensure that there's communication and a sharing of information in the sense that there could be lives put at risk? How do you navigate that? And can any one group, be it the reporter, the source, the government, have a monopoly on that knowledge?
So, first of all, you know, there are 2 conflicting obligations when you are in possession of information that the government has said should be secret. One side of that obligation is what you just said, which is you want to make sure that you're disclosing what you disclose responsibly so that you're not putting lives in danger. There's another side of the responsibility, though, which is that you don't err on the side of caution, that you don't end up suppressing information that ought to be public. Because it's one thing for the government to conceal information that ought to be public, that's corrupt enough. But for journalists whose core defining obligation is to inform the public of what they ought to know. To be engaged in the process of concealing information that ought to be disclosed is way worse. Whether they're doing it out of ideological reasons or out of a fear of being prosecuted or whatever the reason. And when, every time when you're a journalist, you report things that the government doesn't want the public to know, you immediately get accused of endangering national security, helping the terrorists, the whole litany of accusations. It's just a script from which they read reflexively. That really never concerned me much here. I feel like we were very careful to protect the identity of agents and to protect legitimate operations from being unilaterally destroyed. But terrorists have known forever that their electronic communications are being monitored by the US and the British and the Canadian and the Australian and the New Zealand government. In fact, Osama bin Laden famously only communicated by personal courier. There are documents in the archive, one of which we published, where the British have called it a jihadi operational security manual, where terrorists are talking 10 years ago about the need to use encryption and methods to evade electronic surveillance, incredibly sophisticated understanding of what these agencies do. We didn't inform the terrorists of anything that they didn't already know. What we informed people of that they didn't know was that this system is directed not at the terrorists, but at entire populations. So I really don't take seriously the criticism that we've done it irresponsibly or put people's lives in danger, because we've been exceedingly careful with what we've published. I take much more seriously the other criticism, which doesn't get heard much because it comes from people who don't have loud platforms. But there is a substantial criticism out there. WikiLeaks has voiced it, other transparency advocates have voiced it, that have criticized us from the other direction, which is that we've been too careful in what we publish. Everyone knows that we have many, 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 many thousands of documents. In that year and a half, we've published a small percentage of them. And what keeps me up at night is not the worry that I've published too much, it's the worry that I've published too little. That's a much more valid criticism to me than the one that gets commonly made by the government and their loyalists in the media. So I think you have to navigate both.
In percentage terms, how much of the material you have you made public?
It's hard to say because we haven't counted the number of documents, and I've always been hesitant to disclose the number that Snowden gave us because it helps the government too much in different ways, but a small percentage, well under 50%, probably less than 10%. We're actually working on ways now to increase that percentage by opening up the archive to journalists around the world who can come and work with it and do reporting and share it with media outlets from multiple different countries. But I do find it ironic that the accusation that's made is that we've been indiscriminate and we've been publishing recklessly, when the reality is we've published probably less than we should have because we've been so cautious in making sure that what we publish not only doesn't jeopardize innocent lives, but more importantly to me, that it can't be used to distract attention away from what ought to be the debate, which is not why did these journalists publish this, but what are these governments doing?
And has the media been too timid?
Yeah, the media, yes, the media is generally too timid. And they've followed suit and played the form in this case, not just in the United States, but in lots of different countries around the world. But having said that, I do think that this has, when I look at the last 16 months, what I see as the most important impact is not how people think about surveillance. It's how people think about government power and the dangers of secrecy and the role of journalism. And I think that as much as the debate over surveillance has been triggered, there has been a debate about journalism that has been triggered. And what is the proper role and relationship between someone who calls themselves a journalist and those who wield the greatest economic and political power? Is it to be at parties with them and to be in the same socioeconomic circle as them and to serve as the primary venue to amplify their message? Or is it to be adversarial, that you're doing your job if they dislike you and are angry with you? Because instead of serving their interest, you're working against them. And instead of amplifying their message, you're scrutinizing and investigating it. And I think this debate about what journalism is has been extremely healthy, in part because I think it has made younger journalists think about what their role ought to be. But I also think it has shamed a lot of institutions. When the light is shined on the role that they're actually playing and how fundamentally disparate it is from the claim they make about what they do.
When I was, this is the last question, so if you want to start moving towards the microphones. When I was researching the blizzard of material and trying to edit it down, I tried to assess impact. What has been the impact? What will the impact be? And I think you're right that it reawakens to many in the journalism world who have been in slumber that they have to do a better job. But I think as well, to personify it, which is what the media does, good or for ill, if you look at the president and his working review group, they actually concluded that Americans must never wholly trust public officials. And it was the nearest sense I've had yet that actually in the heart of the government, there is a sense that while they don't like the tactics and they don't necessarily like some of the messages, and they've been taken out of their comfort zone and put into their infancy in public discussions about secrets, they recognize that perhaps things had gone too far. That's perhaps an optimistic conclusion. What do you think has been the impact?
I do think that's too optimistic of a conclusion when it comes to what people in government think. I think that it's very easy when somebody doesn't wield power to warn of and be appreciative of the dangers of how power can be abused. And then once they acquire power, they become so convinced of their own goodness that they think that those dangers disappear because now a good person instead of a bad person is the one making the decisions about how that power is exercised. And the textbook case of that syndrome is Barack Obama, who vehemently condemned all kinds of policies and powers when they were wielded by George Bush, and then has embraced them extremely enthusiastically, and sometimes more so than Bush did. And I think because he really believes that he doesn't pose the kind of danger that bad people might pose. I think the changes, I never thought that the change to surveillance would come from laws that the US government would enact to limit its own power, because I just don't think generally human beings walk around thinking about ways to limit their own power. I think that the US government will pass some laws that they'll call reform that are really just symbolic, designed to let the system continue while placating public anger. I think it's the consciousness change on the part of people around the world who now understand the way their privacy is being compromised and the value of it that will lead to these kind of changes, whether it's demanding that their own governments work against US hegemony over the internet, or demanding that tech companies like Facebook and Google and Yahoo prove that they'll protect the privacy of their users upon risk of losing generations of users to other companies, industries that will safeguard it better. And probably most importantly, individuals protecting their own privacy through increasingly available technologies of encryption that really do put a wall between what people on the internet are doing and what the government is able to see. And I think all of these things are subverting the surveillance state in a way that's much more effective than laws that Washington might pass and then easily co-opt and subvert.
Okay, so we've got a lot of people at the mics. We're going to be strict here. A question, not a monologue. So, can you give your name? If you're representing a company and affiliation, please say that as well. And a short, sharp question, and we'll get through as many as we can. If we don't get through them all by the time allotted, there is a reception afterwards, which of course you can pigeonhole Glenn on until at least midnight. Okay, let's go to you, sir, over on the aisle to the left. That's the stage.
It's on? Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Salim Khan. I'm with Investigate.net. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the case of journalist Nikki Hager in New Zealand, who was recently raided, and what that says about the prospects for doing this kind of work in liberal democracies.
Yeah, I think it's a really important case to understand so many of these issues that we just discussed. So I'll just give you the quick facts. There's a really well-regarded independent journalist in New Zealand named Nikki Hager, who wrote a book in September or August called Dirty Politics, and it came out about a month before the national election in New Zealand, and it revealed that the New Zealand government, the highest officials in the national party of Prime Minister John Key, was feeding derogatory information to this sleazy right-wing blogger named Cameron Slater. And people always wondered, how did Cameron Slater get all this dirt on liberal political officials? And it turned out Nikki Hager got emails showing that there was coordination between the government feeding the information to him, and it forced the resignation of one of Prime Minister Key's top aides, the Justice Minister. At the same time, we at the Intercept were working with Nikki on reporting stories about New Zealand from the NSA archive. And we were exchanging all kinds of emails back and forth over the course of 2 months, and although they were encrypted, anyone monitoring the metadata, meaning who Nikki is talking to or who we're talking to, would know that we were communicating with him, which would likely mean that Nikki was working with us on NSA documents. About 10 days ago, the New Zealand police went to his house with a search warrant and raided his house for 10 hours. And they took every single computer in his home. He wasn't at home, his daughter was at home. They took all of her computers, they took their iPhones and files and papers, and it was an incredible assault on the news gathering process, whether they were looking for his source for the book that forced this scandal to come to light, or whether they were looking for the top secret documents that we were working on. It shows how easily the state can invade the journalistic process. And this, I think, is a really crucial point. A lot of times we debate surveillance and we think about the impact that it has on the right to privacy, and there's all kinds of debates about that. But living in a surveillance state, which, by the way, we all do, it's a surveillance state by definition when the government collects information about everyone with whom you're communicating and who's calling you, even if they're not reading the content. When you live in a surveillance state, it affects and degrades huge numbers of other civic rights as well, like your free press. How can you have a free press and practice journalism in an environment in which the government knows every single person with whom you're communicating? How can a source come forward to a journalist, email a journalist, or call a journalist with information to whistleblow if they know that their identity is going to be discovered because everybody's communication activities are being recorded? And that case really illustrates just how much of an assault these basic Western liberties that we all think we're guaranteed are actually under in the name of security and terrorism and the like.
All right. To the middle.
Hi, Glenn. I'm Andy. I'm really happy you're here in Toronto. And,
thanks.
This is my question. When you talk about whistleblowers and journalists, you list the heroes that we know, but I never really had a chance to hear or read your opinion on Barrett Brown, who is currently jailed for his Project PM revelations that he got through hacking activity.
I actually wrote an article, I think about a year ago, called The Persecution of Barrett Brown, which gives you a good insight into my opinion on that case. And encourage people to donate to his legal defense fund at the end of the article, and I think it raised something like $50,000 overnight. He's about to be sentenced in a week in a federal court in Houston, and I wrote a letter to the judge vouching for his journalism and encouraging leniency in sentencing. It's a really complicated case. I don't want to take the time to recount the facts. If you're interested, and it is an interesting case, you can search for it online, my article, or lots of others. But there is a huge number of cases in the United States, a lot of them, where people are being prosecuted for the exercise of what's supposed to be their constitutionally guaranteed rights. And oftentimes there are pretexts concocted by the government to make it seem like they're prosecuting people for something else. But there's no question. We think about, dissidents being imprisoned, and we're trained to think about that as happening only in the bad countries. But the reality is there are Western countries, including the United States, where people whose only crime is challenging the government have been imprisoned. And I think Barrett Brown is an excellent example, but there are lots of others as well.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Scott. I have a question. I also have a name tag for you from Paul Calandra. I can give it to you after.
Excellent. Looking forward. I think I requested that on Twitter, didn't I?
Yeah, that's
all right. I appreciate your responsiveness. Very hospitable.
So I'm asking this because of your article on the Woolwich murder. in Britain that you wrote for The Guardian, and we've had a similar incident happen here in Canada. A soldier was killed and another wounded in an apparently deliberate hit and run, and the driver was shot by police after. The Prime Minister called it a possible terrorist attack. His spokesman said the individual had become radicalized. The Public Safety Minister said today the attack was clearly linked to terrorist ideology. One of the soldiers was in uniform during the attack, so I'm just wondering what your kind of opinion is of the media's use of the word terrorist when describing this act.
Yeah, it's a great question. We were talking about this a little bit before because I wanted to write something on this just to make sure I get into maximum amount of trouble while I'm in Canada. And I didn't have time, so I'll give you a little preview of what I'm going to say in what I'm going to publish, I hope, tomorrow. But there's two things I find really fascinating about the reaction, the media and government reaction to an event like that. First of all, Canada is a country, whether you agree with it or not, that has spent 12 years now proclaiming itself to be a nation at war. It has been involved in the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. It has helped the United States in all sorts of ways as part of its proclaimed war on terror. And it's now currently sending its fighter jets to bomb people in Iraq. And yet every time, and we saw this in Britain, we see it in the US all the time, every time there's violence brought back to a country, sending violence all throughout the world, there's this shock and outrage and confusion over why somebody could possibly be so barbaric and savage that they would engage in violence on Canadian soil, as though the assumption is sort of we're just a nation that's very innocent and harms nobody, and why would anybody want possibly to bring violence back here to Canada? And you know, you see this all the time in the US too. And the reality is that if you're going to be a country that says we're going to be a country at war, not for even 6 months or a year, but for many, many years, and use military force in multiple countries around the world, I think it's completely expected, without thinking it's justifiable in any way, that some people are going to want to bring violence back to you. That's how wars work. You don't just get to bomb and kill other people in other countries and have nobody try and do the same to you. So the confusion and the shock is always very surprising and difficult for me to understand given the context in which it's taking place. There's clearly a cause and effect between a lot of these acts and the actions on the part of that government and the nation where those acts occur that seem to get completely suppressed by how they're considered. And then the other question is exactly the one that you raised, which is this idea of calling it a terrorist act. The reality is that terrorism is just a propagandistic term at this point. Nobody can define what it means. It has no consistent application. But whatever it means, it's generally understood to mean, I think, by just its common usage, it has to entail either the reckless and indiscriminate use of violence or the deliberate use of violence against civilians. And yet here is a case where somebody seems to have targeted soldiers in part of a military currently deployed in a war. Whatever else that is, it's not terrorism. You know, the same thing happened in the US when somebody attacked a military installation in Fort Hood and killed 12 soldiers of the United States military while the US military was deployed in multiple wars around the country. In what conceivable sense of the word terrorism is targeting military installations or soldiers of a country at war? Once you start using the term for that, it becomes very evident what the real definition of terrorism is, which is violence that is done against Western countries by Muslims. That's really what the word terrorism means. And so you see both of these dynamics very potently at play in the reaction to that event.
Okay, we're going to keep going. Over to the site.
Hi, my name is Jake Kavanch. I'm a Ryerson journalism student. It's not much of an affiliation, but I like to represent. I'd just like to first of all thank you for your work over the last few years. You really are my inspiration for journalism. I guess my question would be, with the internet and the ability to spread information, it's pretty much unprecedented how quickly you can spread mass amounts of news. Do you think it's going to be harder for governments and corporations to hide information that could be detrimental to the public with this ability to spread information and whistleblow so easily?
Definitely. I mean, the largest governments in the world have a huge problem, which is that the way in which information is stored digitally in massive quantities makes it impossible to prevent its rapid dissemination. You know, if you talk to Daniel Ellsberg, it's bizarre to think about, but his biggest challenge when he wanted to leak the Pentagon Papers was how do you bring 7,000 pages of a top secret document to a Xerox machine and just like in the middle of like a drugstore, you know, like with dimes, you know, replicate it and then bring it to, and this was a huge logistical challenge that he had. It was actually difficult for him to copy that and get that out without being detected. You know, Chelsea Manning gave many hundreds of thousands of pages to WikiLeaks, and I think it took her like a day to copy them all. While I think the story is she was listening to Lady Gaga and pretending that that was the music she had, and she was sticking thumb drives into her computer. And so, because the government can't prevent that information from being disseminated, and then they also can't prevent its disclosure. You know, the U.S. government went to court to stop the New York Times from publishing the Pentagon Papers. How do you prevent a stateless organization like WikiLeaks from doing that? Or how would you stop an Edward Snowden from just uploading them to the internet? It's become impossible, and that's why they've turned to a different tactic to prevent the dissemination of information they want to conceal, which is trying to create this climate of fear where they tell journalists, and especially sources, we will destroy your life if you do this, precisely because they can't safeguard against it. And the internet has made that impossible for them to stop, and so has the way information is stored in the vastness of these systems.
And presumably they're fearful too that there's a contagion where people like Snowden are repeated within the system. You have
right, which is why they want to create this idea that he is this, you know, destined to live this miserable life. That's what that's about. And a big part of what we as journalists want to do, I think, is encourage more Snowdens to come forward. You know, one of the things that one of our main priorities when we created our new media organization at the Intercept was to think about how to create systems where sources could come forward and give us information and communicate with us without any prospect of the government detecting that they've done so. By encrypting it, by using multiple proxies to send the communications around the world. That's part of the struggle, is they want to prevent Snowdens, and we want to hope that more people are inspired to follow his example.
Thank you.
My name is Michael Karen Sadelsky. I'm not with an organization, just a fan. And my question is about another thing about Canada you're not necessarily fond of, which is the criminalization of speech, specifically like a wrong progressive values that you've talked about. And it's usually in the national security framework, but I'm wondering how it relates in terms of harassment, be it things like cyberbullying or something we're seeing at Gamersgate, or even harassment that you've experienced. Do you think there's any space for the criminalization of that harassment? When does speech become harassment? Or do you think that speech should just always be never censored in any manner?
The reason why that's a complicated question is because the appeal of limiting speech is very compelling, because there's certain ideas and there's certain forms of speech that we all recognize as noxious and horrible, and so it seems like a really good idea to let the state decide that certain kinds of speech are so awful that they are not only prohibited but criminalized. And I think the problem with that, and the main reason why I'm generally opposed to any kind of approach like that, is because if you look at just the history and evolution of human knowledge, what is considered to be so unspeakably wrong and awful in one generation very often becomes accepted and recognized as truth in the next one or the next one or the one after that. And I don't trust any human being to be able to declare that certain views or certain ideas or certain forms of speech are so objectively wrong that they actually can't even be aired. I think that the abuse that comes from that is much more dangerous than the speech itself. Horrible ideas, I think, usually are much more easily defeated by engaging them and proving how horrible they are than trying to ban them, which sends them underground and often even strengthens them by letting their advocates become martyrs. I think there's this assumption that if we allow the state to criminalize certain ideas, that it's going to be the ideas that we hate that end up on the prohibited list. But so often, it ends up being different ideas that end up getting banned, and often including our own. So I'm just very distrustful of anybody who is so enamored of their own abilities that they think that they can always know in some universal way which ideas are bad enough to be criminalized. I'd much rather take horrible ideas and engage them and stomp them than I would say I'm so afraid of them that I want the state to put people in prison who express them.
Okay, we're going to have time for a couple more questions. So we're going to keep questions short and answers short, please.
Greetings, thanks for coming. James Cullingham of Seneca College and Tamarack Productions in Toronto. When you're talking about the balance you had to achieve between irresponsibility that your critics were leveling at you and caution, I believe you said you had to protect, or you felt you had to protect legitimate operations. So what's a legitimate operation, and how do you make that decision?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things that has been really overlooked in how our reporting has been done is what a significant role our source played in what kinds of stories ended up getting published. And I've actually told this to the NSA before, although they didn't really seem to appreciate it, which was that they should be really grateful to Edward Snowden because they got really lucky that they had such a careful, cautious, one might even say conservative whistleblower, at least as conservative as someone can be who takes tens of thousands of top secret documents that they're not authorized to take. Because he had very strong ideas about what kinds of stories he wanted published and what he didn't want published. He was really opposed, for example, to our reporting and publishing surveillance programs in war zones. We ended up doing some of that reporting, but the reality is that we had an agreement with him and a framework with him about what kinds of reporting we would do that I have felt duty-bound to adhere to, even when I didn't always agree with that. I probably would have published a lot more. I probably have a more restrictive understanding of legitimate operations than he does. But I'll just say this about what he wanted. And you can agree with it or disagree with it, but it has really guided the reporting. One of the things he said really early on and that he stuck to and emphasized so much was, he said, my big problem with what the US government and its allies have done is not necessarily that they have implemented these surveillance systems. It's that they implemented it without any knowledge on the part of the citizenry, which therefore prevented any democratic debate about whether we wanted our governments to do these things. They just made the unilateral decision on their own in the dark that these programs should exist. And what he said was, I don't want to do reporting that destroys these programs, because I don't think I, Edward Snowden, have any more of a right unilaterally to destroy these programs than the US government had the unilateral right to implement them. He wanted simply to do enough reporting that would let the public have an understanding of what these capabilities were so that there could be a debate about whether or not they should continue. And I don't necessarily agree with that framework completely, and I've talked about it with him a lot, but that was the framework on which he insisted, and I think as a journalist you're bound to your agreement with your source, and so that's been the principle that more than anything else has guided the decisions we've made.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from Twitter. I apologize to the rest of you at the microphones. We're going to have to close it shortly after this, but we will be available afterwards for conversation.
Twitter plagues you even when you're not near a computer.
That's
it just
right.
follows, there's no escape.
And I hope I'm pronouncing it right. This is from Graciela Neruda, who asks, who would you like to give a piece of your mind to now that you have debated the former head of the NSA and CIA, Michael Hayden? Who would be your next?
Well, ironically, if I had to pick two people who I wanted to debate, it would have been Michael Hayden and Alan Dershowitz. And it was actually funny because before the debate, I was being interviewed by Stephanie Nolan, who's with the Globe and Mail based in Rio de Janeiro, where I live, and she interviewed me the day before I left for Toronto about the debate, and we were talking about it, and I said, you know, I'm having actually a kind of crisis of conscience over going to this event, because when you go to these kind of debates, like the Monk debate, it's very prestigious. You know, you're expected to be very civil to your adversaries. Like, you're supposed to go to the cocktail party before, and you shake their hands after, and like you chatter with them. and you say like, well done, spirited debate, like, and I was saying, you know, like Michael Hayden is actually a war criminal, right? Like that he actually implemented torture. And was at the CIA for all those years under George Bush, and Alan Dershowitz just, you know, has endorsed every hideous, you know, violent policy. And I was telling her about how, you know, my difficulty was that I was expected to go to this thing and be civil to two of the most pernicious people on the planet. And I guess, you know, wisely the Globe and Mail took this profile that they had done of me, and on the opposite page was Hayden, and the quote they pulled out was, Michael Hayden and Alan Dershowitz are, quote, two of the most pernicious people on the planet. So they were really high up on my list. You know, I guess if I could interview one person or debate one person, it would probably be President Obama, because I would just love to do nothing more than just take all of the statements that he made when he was asking the American citizenry to empower him with the presidency, and to then contrast it with everything that he's actually done, and to have him explain why they're polar opposites. And I think it would be, I mean, I would need hours to do each and every one of those instances, but I would like to understand what his core excuse is for that behavior.
Maybe next time you're in Toronto, we can arrange that.
Yeah, the monk debate.
I just have, I've been passed a piece of very sad breaking news. It's being attributed to ABC News, Time, and the Washington Post, that Ben Bradley, the Washington Post editor during Watergate, has died at the age of 93. So that's just happening this evening. Glenn, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Really appreciate it.
I'd like to welcome John Cruikshank back to the stage.
Thank you.
Let me do two pieces of business. One is to thank CNW for the video that we saw, thank the Globe and Mail for the in-kind support for the event, and on behalf of the Canadian Journalism Foundation and yours, thank David and Glenn for an astonishing evening. Thank you so much. And next, please join us in the lobby for a reception. Good night.